It's been more than 3 years since the COVID-19 pandemic led to governments across the globe locking their citizens down and then eventually allowing things to open back up, but with masks, and you had a whole host of complications from those lockdowns that are now becoming more evident. As displayed in a recent Chicago Tribune article by Cory and Robert Weinstein, the headline, "Excess Deaths in the U.S. are rising at a shocking rate." Now, I want to go through some of this and also share some of the alternative side of this conversation from Del Bigtree. He's a host of The High Wire. Recently had Neil deGrasse Tyson on. I want to watch that entire interview. I'm sure it's fascinating, but Del Bigtree, I think, encapsulates some of what the alternative voices are saying about the COVID-19 pandemic and the after effects. But I do want to read from the Tribune article here from Cory and Robert Weinstein. They say the COVID-19 situation in the U.S. is both good and bad. They say the good news is that COVID-19 deaths are at the lowest levels in the 3-year pandemic. Given current trends, predictions indicate roughly 100,000 COVID-19 deaths for 2023. That's less than half of any of the 3 previous years. The bad news, they say, is that the number of overall excess U.S. deaths, that's the difference between expected number of deaths from all causes and the actual number of deaths observed, is rising at a shocking rate, they say. COVID-19 is a factor, but the main causes of excess deaths are more social than medical. And the worst aspect is that they are occurring in the younger demographic, in which homicides, suicides, vehicular deaths, and drugs are taking a disproportionate toll on what should be the healthiest sector of the population. So they go on to discuss the excess deaths in the United States, which is more than 1.25 million, about 15% higher than in the pre-pandemic years. I want to repeat that. It's about 15% higher of excess deaths. Deaths that didn't match up with an average. So 15% higher than in pre-pandemic years. Patterns not limited to the U.S. You've got excess pandemic deaths elevated by 5 to 20% in Great Britain, in most of Europe, and Australia. Now, the most reasons for these, they say, are multifactorial. You've got past COVID infections that could be long COVID, any other actual viral infection like COVID-19 may subside, but patients can suffer long-term complications, they say. You've also got in other areas, they describe unanticipated effects of the lockdowns. And I think this is important to highlight because this is a mainstream recognition of the negative effects, the negative health effects from the COVID-19 government-imposed lockdowns, including keeping kids from going to school and telling people, hey, don't go to public places. That put fear in a lot of people from going to the doctor, for instance. And again, Cory and Robert Weinstein from the Chicago Tribune reporting on this. And I believe that they wrote this for the Tribune, but ultimately they highlight that the effects of the pandemic lockdowns, the societal disruptions, have been just as important as COVID-19 itself. Patients have found it more difficult to access care. Appointments and physicians have been delayed. Routine surgeries, including biopsies, have been canceled. And even when patients suffer symptoms, many have avoided clinics and hospitals, fearing COVID-19 or just long waits. While telemedicine's helped, suspicious lumps cannot be diagnosed on Zoom. So they highlight how the U.S. diagnosis rates of 6 common cancers fell between 16% and 42% during the early days of the pandemic. Those figures possibly could have led to people not getting diagnosed and ultimately running into serious health problems down the line without catching it early. And I think that catching it early is extremely important. I mean, I've shared a personal story. My wife, I felt a lump on her breast the day before going into the pandemic lockdown imposed by Governor J.B. Pritzker, and she did not hesitate. And I thank her so much for getting into the doctor, getting an appointment, getting a biopsy, getting diagnosed, going through all of the treatments, mostly by herself, having to go into those rooms for those treatments because the pandemic didn't, the hospitals are like, oh, only she can go back there, no friends or family. But she got it done. She did it. And it's an incredible thing. Early detection really can save lives, and staying on top of things can save lives too. But the pandemic put a lot of that on hold for some people. because of the constant fear that they were getting pumped with about the possibility of catching COVID. Now, they go on to say from this Chicago Tribune article, while the fairly strict lockdowns of the U.S., Australia, and Western Europe have clearly contributed to excess deaths, Sweden's notable because government pandemic restrictions were not nearly as stringent as they were with fewer lockdown deaths. Initially, Sweden was criticized heavily for its more lenient approach to the pandemic, but Sweden has had one of the lowest total excess mortality rates in Europe since the beginning of the pandemic. So that's an interesting indicator there. I do want to go now to Del Bigtree with the High Wire. This is a clip of him talking with, actually, I guess, just lecturing Neil deGrasse Tyson about the alternative perspective on what happened with the COVID-19 situation and how people's trust in science and the data was severely rocked. And he provides some other suggestions, too. We'll play this for you here on WMAY.
Of course.
And I actually believe that we are seeing a rise in all-cause mortality around the world, that many studies are now showing the more vaccinated a country was, the higher their excess mortality now. So we may retrospectively look back and find out that this vaccine was more deadly than the virus ever was. That still holds out for our reference to this. And then, armchair quarterback, we will decide who was glad they signed on, or,
Monday quarterback.
Okay.
Yeah.
We will decide who was glad they signed on to the social contract. I do not believe that things can be mandated on me, especially. Here's my problem. I cannot trust science, and my audience will not trust science, that continues to say we will not let top officials at the table that have now proven to be right. When we see emails that said just keep them out of the room, and they are the ones that ended up being right about this virus. I will not trust the head task force when they come forward and say, I always knew it wouldn't stop transmission, even though you and Neil deGrasse Tyson were telling you get it to protect each other. I always knew it never could do that. So we're going to have a hard time getting back to a place of trust. What we need now is a regulatory agency and people in charge that get back to actually listening to, as you said, those people that are challenging this from all sides. The challenge has to be allowed into the room, and it's not. Science is dead in my mind. The scientific method is dead, and I think the coronavirus experiment proves that we are in a terrifying moment of science. And I reach out to you to think about what we've said here today and say, is he right? Did the scientific method take place? Is it taking place now, retrospectively? Even if you want to argue in an emergency, we made decisions and we rushed things. Why is Peter McCullough and why is Robert Malone and the people that were right, why are they not at the table now?
So again, that's Del Bigtree. One of the things he said right up front was that he believes that in the long term, it's going to find that the COVID vaccine is the reason for excess mortality. So I think everybody recognizes excess mortality is an issue. All right, even this mainstream news article from the Chicago Tribune, Cory and Robert Weinstein, excess deaths in the U.S. at rising at a shocking rate, 15% since before the COVID pandemic. Del Bigtree suggests that it's the vaccines. Well, they do address this in that Tribune article. They say there's a minority theory that vaccine complications have contributed to excess deaths. However, there is no reliable data from any country supporting this belief, and the experience of Sweden, which has a higher full vaccination rate than the world average, belies this notion. Belies this notion. You got, of course, you look at this from all sides here. Everybody recognizes excess mortality is a serious issue. And I think everybody recognizes that the lockdowns imposed by governments did not help the situation and exacerbated the situation. Whether or not the vaccine is something at role here, talk to your doctor about that and have that conversation with your family. But of course, we got to trust the science, right? We got to look at the data, and the data suggests that the lockdowns were not beneficial to overall health. And that seems to be recognized from all around now, at least that particular aspect. All right, got to take a break. It is Springfield's Morning News on WM.